Everybody, welcome to External Design Systems in Practice. Certainly tough act to follow after all those very inspiring middle school kids, but we can finally get back to agency case studies and really important stuff. So the slides, there's a bit.ly link here, bit.ly external DSTCD -TCD if people want to follow along or grab the slides later. I'll tweet them out too. I am Brian Perry. I'm a lead front-end developer at Bounteous. I live in the Chicago suburbs. I'm a lover of all things component and component-driven. So building with components in Drupal, design systems and tools like Pattern Lab, obviously very relevant to what we'll be talking about today. And increasingly building with component-based JavaScript frameworks like React. Also a lover of all things Nintendo, so if you want to talk about the cool games you're playing on your Switch, I'm totally game. Les already did his job and talked to me about that last night at the party. I'm playing Cuphead with my son obsessively, which is an incredibly difficult game, but we are almost done. I'm also increasingly interested in the Jamstack and using like non-LAMP stack-based things and static sites and the opportunities that opens up too. I'm also on the internet in a bunch of places and would love to internet with you. So as I mentioned, I work at a company called Bounteous. We've got a couple of offices in the Chicago area, but a number throughout the US and even beyond. I work with a bunch of folks in a great Drupal practice, but Drupal is one of a handful of things that we do, but I get to learn a lot from the Drupal folks that I work with. We're often hiring, so if you're looking to do great Drupal work, definitely get in touch, and if you're looking to have great Drupal work done, I can also get you in touch with somebody there. But also, if you have run into me before at a camp or have seen me talk, you may not know of me as working at a company called Bounteous. You may know me as working at a company called HS2 Solutions. I didn't quit, although it's fun to pretend that I did. We rebranded, and this is the previous company info slide that I had in my deck. But that rebranding process kind of is a jumping off point into what we'll talk about today. So this rebranding story is kind of where we'll start. And this project kind of, I changed a little bit the approach to how I've been using a pattern library and a design system. And it opened up some interesting possibilities. So we'll start there and then look at some other applications as well. But specifically looking at this rebranding, we had our HS2 Solutions website, and we had a concept for our new brand. So we were looking to rebrand the site. Our brand launch was targeted for November 5th, 2018. And although it didn't necessarily feel like that to me on a day-to-day basis, the website was just a small piece of the puzzle. The press releases and new business cards, new email addresses, letting our clients know, things like that. And then also, as part of this process, part of the reason that we were rebranding is because over the past year or so, we had acquired a few companies and kind of evolved into this new thing. So there was a migration effort to what we were doing. We were taking our old Drupal 7 site. Also, Lunametrics was a WordPress site. Infield Digital was also a WordPress site. And we wanted to take content from those sites, migrate them into our new Drupal 8 build under the new brand. Focusing mostly on content from the blogs, especially Lunametrics. They had a great back history of blog content. For more of the marketing thing, since we were rebranding, a lot of that we were kind of creating from scratch anyway. But still a lot of content being migrated into the new site. Nate was kind of taking the lead on that process and getting the new migrated data in place. And then meanwhile, Leon on the XD team was kind of leading the charge with initial wireframes and concepts, creating things in Sketch, sharing them with the team through InVision. And I was doing my best to follow along and prototype in code using Pattern Lab. So, being able to see things in a browser, work at different breakpoints that maybe aren't covered in these wireframes, just see kind of those edge cases, see if this would really stand up in a browser. And then as the concept evolved, we went into higher fidelity mock-ups, Jolene was leading the process there, but I continued to do the same thing and try to follow along as close as I could in Pattern Lab and keep prototyping these things so we could see them in a browser. So that kind of brings us to the point where we have the concepts that we've built out in Pattern Lab, some data that's been migrated into the start of our new Drupal 8 build, and we have to start thinking about how we're actually going to integrate the design system that we've built into this Drupal site. Or using this ridiculous example that we'll get to in a second, where we want to put the mustard. So the example that I'm going to use here is mustard anise, so a jar of combined mustard and mayonnaise, versus separate mustard and mayonnaise. And if you understand where that mustard anise image is from, you get immediate points with me as a comedy nerd, but no worries if you don't. So the mustard anise approach is kind of what I had been doing in the past on projects, Drupal projects that use this kind of component-based approach, where the Pattern Lab instance was actually embedded inside of the Drupal theme. So there's advantages and disadvantages to that approach. On the plus side, it's a little bit easier for Drupal to get at these components since they live right in the theme, and it potentially simplifies the build process a little bit. It's also easier for developers who might not be familiar with this approach to understand. They look in the theme, they see the theme things, they can mess around with them, it makes sense. At the same time, it's also kind of prone to Drupalisms and Drupal-specific concepts finding their way into the components. So depending on what you're looking to do with this design system, and if you're trying to use it outside of Drupal, that may or may not be a problem. Versus kind of where we were at this point in the project, where we really had individual separate projects. We had a Drupal repository where we were working on the migrations, and we had this separate design system repository, and as of now, those things were not joined together. But theoretically, that approach is going to promote reuse beyond just a single Drupal project. So, the question that we had to ask is where we wanted to put the mustard in this case. So, decided here to keep the mustard separate. We were not going to have Heinz Mayo Must, which is a real thing that you can actually buy for some reason. But again, so some of the reasons behind this decision, keeping the components Drupal agnostic. I also think that it encourages prototyping. Once you kind of move Pattern Lab into the context of Drupal, I find that people tend to keep building through Drupal and implementing things on the Drupal side first. And with it separate, I think it does encourage people to experiment in Pattern Lab and continue to use it as a prototyping tool. And it already was a separate project, so it was kind of at that point also the path of least resistance. And there were some gut feelings that went into the decision as well. So it's always conceptually felt like the right approach, even if it wasn't the approach that I followed. It's advocated by many in the community whose opinions that I trust. And also there was the thought that we might be able to reuse this design system for other web projects that are related to our brand, although at this point no real concrete plans to do that. But also for our company, it felt right. We have a growing company with a bunch of diverse skills. All the people in this little GIF are not all developers, and they're not all front-end developers. But we do have quite a few front-end developers, not all of whom work with Drupal or are familiar with Drupal. So for us, I think it had the advantage that it would allow more people who can do good front-end work to contribute to our website in some interesting ways. So now that we kind of made that decision, let's talk about how this actually works and how we can get this design system into our project as a dependency. We're using the PHP version of Pattern Lab, so it's a composer dependency in this case. So in the design system repository, we created a simple composer.json file, gave it a name, a description, and then defined a type of design system. We just made that up. You can create that as whatever you want. We'll see how that's get used in a second. And then in the Drupal project, in the Drupal project's composer.json, we need to do a few things to add the dependency of the design system. So in the repository section, we added the Git Bitbucket link here. And then in the extra section, we added an installer types of design system. That was the installer type that we created. And then under the installer paths, we just say for a dependency of type design system, here's where we're going to put it. Just in the same way that themes go in a particular place and contrib modules go in a specific place. So in this case, it's in the theme in a libraries directory, kind of indicating that this is a dependency don't touch, but kind of went back and forth on where that really belonged. What I wanted to avoid there was having a separate set of composer dependencies in the theme and then some at the root of the project and having to run multiple composer installs. But I also found that if you just had it as a dependency of the root of the project but didn't move it out of the vendor directory, it was hard for the theme to actually get into things nested deep in the vendor directory. So that's kind of how we ended up there. But at that point, the project is aware of the design system, and we can composer require it, and it gets pulled in as a dependency. We required it at dev for the pre-launch cycle because there were a lot of changes being made, so we'd always be up to date with the latest development. And then we have the control to pull in the latest version of the design system when we want changes. So we can just do composer update to pull in the new code, and we're good to go. Releases can be tagged in the design system, so we can have more fine-grained control over which version of the design system we want to have in our Drupal theme. We can require a specific release or a specific commit and things like that. We did mostly kind of just require it at the head, which, as we'll talk about in a little bit, kind of can become a challenge. So now we have that as a dependency in our Drupal project. Here's how we incorporate it into the theme. Nothing really all that unique or mind-blowing here, but in our libraries.yaml file, we added a few things to the global library. So we have the compiled CSS, and we have our JavaScript bundles that come from the design system. So that just gets loaded with the global library. And then using the components module, we also defined a few twig namespaces that relate to kind of the different levels of our design system. So we weren't using the traditional atomic design naming exactly, but still in the same neighborhood. So that lets Drupal be aware of these twig templates that live somewhere else, and also lets us use @ and then the namespace as a shortcut when we reference these files. All right, so our theme's now aware of the design system and that dependency. So let's talk a little bit about some of the workflows that I saw the team kind of falling into. So building out the rest of our front-end components beyond just the initial prototypes. Sean on our team ended up doing a lot of that work. And Sean can do Drupal, but he's also someone who is especially efficient just writing good kind of CMS-agnostic HTML, CSS, and JavaScript code. So he focused his work inside of the design system and created the bulk of our remaining front-end components, and only had 2 commits in the Drupal repository. But without him, we wouldn't have had a theme. And then Wade was kind of the middleman, working in the Drupal repository, wiring up those components to Drupal. So he was wiring up to Drupal content, including them in layouts and layout builder. The majority of his effort was in the Drupal repository, but there were cases where maybe something Drupal specific wasn't accounted for in some of our components, or there's something that he could do to kind of make his life a little bit easier, where he'd end up with work done in the design system as well. But that split ended up working pretty well, and I think it allowed people to be pretty efficient. And then, as is often the case on any project, and a project like this with a really explicit, tight timeline, there were some changes in scope and the project that really made the fact that we had this design system an advantage that we really didn't necessarily know in advance. So, for the Lunametrics site, they offer, and still as part of Bounteous do offer a number of trainings throughout the US for things like Google Analytics, Google Tag Manager, and other trainings. And they had a training section of their site that had all the upcoming trainings, but also a place where you could register and sign up for training classes. And we determined that we weren't going to be able to rebuild all this functionality in the timeline that we had, especially because there was some new functionality that was kind of just recently built out for the training section. So we came to the conclusion that we were going to have the WordPress site live on, specifically just the training section of the site would be included in the main menu on the new site, and it would have to match the look and feel of our new build, but still on this WordPress site. And I don't think that's something we could have even really considered if we didn't have that design system as a tool. So let's look a little bit about how that actually works. So the WordPress integration, we worked with a company called Lalia Creative, who did the initial theme of the Lunametric site and was available to help us out, which is great because we needed some extra hands. So we shared the design system with them, explained what was there and what tools were available. And they took an initial pass at a prototype using a plugin called Timber that I wasn't aware of. They introduced us to it, which allows you to use Twig in WordPress. So they were able in that initial prototype to actually use the same components that were being used in the Drupal build from the design system right as they stood. So that allowed them to build things out pretty quickly and prove that we could make something that it was going to look like the rest of the intended site. I also love Timber's, part of Timber's slogan here, because WordPress is awesome, but the loop isn't. Depending on your stance on WordPress, you may or may not agree with that. So here's what that actually looks like. So on the training page, there's a list of upcoming trainings, and then we have these training item rows. So in this training module.php template, we have like a wrapping div with some classes, but then a for loop that just kind of goes through the available data for these training events, and then assembles a training element with an array of data. Not really all that dissimilar from something that looks like a render array or something like that. And then in training element.php here, all we're doing is saying Timber, render, the name of the Twig template that we want to render, and passing in that data that we've assembled for this to spit out all of those training elements. So pretty straightforward, and allows us to use, again, that same template. So that allowed us to build out a version of the training site that looks like our new theme, fits into the Drupal 8 site, fakes its way into the menu, all that good stuff. Leading up to the actual launch on our timeline, there definitely were some cases where we got a little bit away from the Timber approach and did some more traditional WordPress kind of theming approaches to kind of make it in under the wire. We'll talk a little bit later about kind of the impact that had. And then also really close to our launch, we also found out that we'd have a new company joining the family, DMAC Media in Toronto, and they were going to be rebranded as Bounteous.ca. Because of the timeline and a handful of other reasons, we knew this was going to be a bit of a smaller scale effort. There was going to be some things that looked a little bit different from the main Bounteous site. But we were able to, in a kind of initial call where we kind of got the developers together, explain them we have this design system repository, we can give you access to it, here's what's in it, you can use it however is going to be the most useful for you. So for them it was more of a selective thing where they were kind of picking and choosing classes and some markup, but also using some of the same assets as they stood, so things certainly look the same or in the same neighborhood, but hopefully it just helped them kind of accelerate getting this thing reskinned because they did not have a lot of time. So we made it, is the good news. We made our November timeline, got things out the door, everybody took a nap afterwards, but then we kind of go into the post-launch world. And I was rolling off of kind of day-to-day on this project. Other developers coming on to help out. Kyle and Steve, for example. And at this point, a lot of the efforts that we had were really mainly focused on things on the Drupal side. Some new functionality, improvements. That's obviously where the bulk of our effort was going to be going forward on this site. So for them, and I'm kind of paraphrasing or putting words in their mouths a little bit here, but like seeing the dependency on the design system and things live in a bit of a different place from where they're used to, they're kind of wondering, I've just got this Drupal ticket I've got to fix. Why can't I just do my Drupal things? Which is a completely reasonable question for them to ask. And kind of out of that process, a few things that we learned and I learned. One is that documentation is really important for this sort of thing. So not only just how does this workflow actually work, which we did have documented, but one thing that was missing was why. And I think that really would have helped, like explaining a little bit more about like why we did this, what it allowed the other sites to do, beyond just like, here's how you do it, this is just different, would have helped. And then was able to kind of get some of this in place before people came on, but we definitely found that it was important to have a more efficient workflow to experiment in the context of Drupal without having like make commits in the design system, pull in the dependency, see if it worked in Drupal, found that maybe it didn't, and then do the whole process over. So nothing all that complicated here, but we just had like a local checkout of the design system and gulp tasks that you could run so that you could experiment in the design system, copy the files over into Drupal, make sure things were good to go, and then have those commits that were in the design system and then come down through the composer dependency. Also versioning, we were a little loose with versioning, just getting to launch, but as the team kind of took on more complicated features and had kind of different branches in play, not being strict about versioning in the design system became a problem, where there were some cases where we found that styling fixes or styling for new features were leaking into releases. So it is important, even though sometimes it maybe feels like a little bit of a pain, to tag releases in the design system and be strict about pulling in at particular releases. And then even just kind of listing out all those things makes it pretty obvious, but this approach definitely does have overhead, especially when you get back to mainly the context of just Drupal. So you got to kind of weigh the pluses and minuses to taking this approach. And then in general, I see this as a good thing, but also the lines between the CMSs here kind of blur. So we did something like change a hover style to those training elements that we looked at, and Kristen testing things out, or others would just expect that those changes, those front-end changes, would just apply in both places. But in the cases where we didn't literally use the same templates, that might not be the case. So the expectation, though, when we have this unified look and feel is that it's really just one thing and is going to apply everywhere. So after launch, we took the time to incorporate more of those Timber templates and do more to have it like a full dependency of the project so that as we made changes, they would apply to both Drupal and WordPress. So that was kind of an overview of that approach with the Bounteous project. And now we'll talk about, and I was even thinking about it as we were going through that, like how this sort of concept could apply to like a decoupled Drupal build, or a case where we don't have the advantage of having all of the projects using the same templating engine like Twig. So this is an ongoing project, a client project, so talking about it a little bit of a high level, but so it's a progressively decoupled Drupal project. So there's Drupal portions of the site, so there's a traditional Drupal build, but also Drupal is providing APIs that are going to be consumed by React. And then React consumes those APIs, and the functionality that it's providing in this case is essentially like an authenticated user portal. And then there's also going to be, that user portal is still going to be rendered by Drupal. So Drupal is going to handle the initial page load, but hand over to Drupal. Kim was a little tired when I put together the slides, some really awful ways to describe combined Drupal and React. I don't know if any of them will catch on. But at least there's the nice React for Drupal logo that I was able to borrow. So yeah, there's still some traditional Drupal pages, but also like a namespace set of routes that are handled by React. So I'm looking at this at a few different levels, right? There's different developer contexts that we have here, and different developers on the project that have different focuses. So we have Drupal developers who may be doing things that really don't involve React at all. So we want to make it easy for them to be able to do their Drupal things. And then we have React developers who are familiar with a particular workflow and focusing on writing React code. So we also want people to be able to do things like develop and test without like a full Drupal VM spun up. And also, they want their workflow. They want things like hot module reloading so that they make changes in their JavaScript code and it's immediately reflected in the browser. But also, obviously, we really do need to look at the context of the real combined thing, because that's the actual site that we're going to deliver at the end of the day. So we need people to be able to work in that context too. And then also thinking about templating and styles, because this is, while there are separate repositories, it's still one website at the end of the day. So there's some different contexts there. The Drupal site uses Twig for its templates. It's going to have some shared overall styles, but also some of its own styles and components. The React project is going to use JSX, but it also has some of its own components. And there's also the middle ground, so global styles, things like typography and buttons and headers and things like that. They're obviously going to be shared in both places. And we're still trying to feel out if there really are components that are shared between both things. Right now, there doesn't seem to be a ton of overlaps at the component level, more the global style level. So it definitely is another case where there does seem to be an opportunity for something in the middle, some sort of design system that can be a dependency of both of these projects. Mostly in this case, to be able to provide those global styles. So here's how we've been kind of approaching this so far and trying to solve this problem. So around the time that we were starting up this project and trying to figure out how to work with the kind of the shared element of these projects, I've always been interested, working with my experience, like working with React in all the CSS and JS solutions. Whole different rabbit hole to go down there. But one thing that I heard coming up a lot frequently was CSS modules as an option there. John Albin did a great talk at DrupalCon that ends up kind of focusing a lot on CSS modules. Gatsby, which is very popular in the Drupal community. Joe did a great Gatsby talk this morning. It also ships with CSS module support out of the box. Read some good blog posts and articles on it as well. Something that I kept hearing more and more about. And the more I learned about it, it seemed to be something that would be well suited to this use case we were trying to solve for. So a little bit more about what CSS modules actually is. Who has actually used CSS modules at all? Has any experience with it? This is the first time ever in a talk I've asked a question like that and gotten a 0. So we can all learn together. So CSS modules, it's not like an NPM package. It's not a dependency that you pull into your project. It's something that's part of a build process. It's the way that these CSS assets are handled when something like Webpack bundles them together. So the most interesting thing that it does is it scopes styles locally by default. So CSS typically is global. You write a style like body background color red, it's going to affect the body. Or if you have just a generic class, it can cascade down and affect other things. And that is potentially a great advantage of CSS, because you can write rules with a small amount of code that apply pretty broadly. But it can also be a problem where somebody's making a CSS fix that bumps into something else that's supposed to stay the same. So this aims to give you the ability to really scope it at a component level. And we'll look at exactly what that looks like. But it can also play nicely, even though it's called CSS modules, it can play nicely with Sass. So if you like using Sass, you can still keep doing that. And it also has a super snarky logo where the word modules is out of its bounding box, which I appreciate. So let's actually just look at an example to kind of explain a little bit more about what that scoped CSS thing means. So this is just a little static site that I've built about static sites with Drupal specifically. But we're just looking at the project card, so one of these cards here, not a very complicated component. And it has a Sass partial that has some styles. It almost kind of doesn't matter what the styles are, but you can just see the basic structure. There's the project card class at the kind of top level of the component, and then some elements within, title, language, description, etc. And it's in this project card.module.css file. This is an example of a Gatsby project, and Gatsby specifically, if it has that module, it applies the CSS Modules approach to it. So in the project card React component here, so we can actually just import that Sass partial. So here we're saying import styles. It's going to create an object called styles that has all of the classes in that Sass partial, the one that we define. And then we can reference them explicitly in our JSX for our component. So you'll see there's the class name styles.projectCards, just that project card class. And really follows the structure that we saw in that Sass partial. We got class name styles.language for the language div, title, etc. So what that ends up doing, at the end of the day, it's going to give us in the generated markup these class names that are unique, so that they're not going to apply outside of this component. So you see there's project card module and then project card class. Project card is the component, and then there's the class, and then there's some additional text to make it unique. So all the same styles are being applied, but because they have that essentially gobbledygook class, it prevents them from running into other styles that might be similar. It's really going to be scoped to just this component. So that's cool if you want your style scoped to your component. Depending on what you're doing, you may or may not want that. But it also it's very easy to just use global CSS in a React project like this, for example, as well. So we have just this. This is what the same component would look like if we weren't using CSS modules, but wanted global CSS imported here. So we just have our .css file, not .modules, .scss, just .scss. So that the styles in that end up being imported globally. So they would be handled just like if you just imported a style sheet just in the HTML file, or what will typically happen in Drupal. And then you can still use class name to reference all the classes here, but again, that's not scoped to this component in any way. So you can do both. So you could have global styles that you import this way, and then things that are scoped to your component if you want them to be. So that was a little bit React specific, but I at least wanted to explain what CSS modules can do and some of its powers. But also gets to the point where we can see a little bit more clearly how we're using that in our design system for this particular project. So in that design system dependency in the middle, we have a few things in place. It's actually just a really simple Gatsby site that just shows what those global styles will look like, just a place where you can see them and experiment with them when you're developing. And it uses CSS modules, and also it's just a bunch of Sass partials at the end of the day. But what that really does is it lets each of these projects that use different templating engines consume those Sass partials however they want to. So on the React side of things, they get imported into the JavaScript. And there's a mix of global and component scope. So things like, again, typography and global rules and spacing scales and things like that are imported globally. But our React developers do prefer to scope things at the component level. So maybe even for something like a button component, they're actually just going to import that button component and have it scoped just at the components so that they don't leak out at all. And then on the Drupal side of things, we're, at least this is typically my approach. Others may take slightly different takes on this, but really we're just compiling one big global CSS file. And we can still do that. We reference just the Sass partials from the design system that we want, and that gets all compiled together and used globally in Drupal. But it's a way that we can write these styles once, and each system can use them however they want. It's pulled in as an NPM dependency, and we're using Webpack in both of the projects to compile things together. So a little bit of a look at what that actually looks like. It's kind of just the NPM version of some of the composer dependency stuff that we talked about before. But so you can add a dependency in your package.json file that just references a Git repository. So it's just our Git repository tagged as a particular release. And then one trick that I didn't know going into this that's pretty handy is that with Webpack, you can use a tilde to tell it that it's a non-relative import. What that really does at the end of the day is make it look in node modules. So we can have, this is a SAS file that's pulling in a bunch of different partials. The ones with the tilde are just looking in the node modules folder for our design system dependency. So we're picking and choosing the stuff that we want to use in Drupal. But then we also have stuff that's local. So that base Drupal partial, and then we have some component partials that we're pulling in as well that are part of this code base. So we can just kind of combine everything together, all the pieces that we want in this thing that gets compiled by Webpack. So kind of wrapping up on this, but a little bit about what we aren't doing yet. So, and I kind of alluded to it before, we really aren't sharing components. It's mostly these global styles. We've been wondering if there was going to be a place for that. So far, there really doesn't seem to be a ton of overlap between the Drupal specific things and the React specific things. They kind of have a bit of a different UI. So we haven't really had a need to do it. And even if we do get to the point where there would be some things that could be shared, it's kind of a hard problem to solve. I think it would require basically more JavaScript at the end of the day. We either have to use the React components in Drupal where we're sharing things, or do something like create web components that could then be used by both Drupal and React. And it's a different can of worms. I think it's definitely an interesting, desirable problem to solve, but there's not really a compelling reason for us to do it now in this project. And then we talked a little bit about the hot module replacement and that React experience. And our React developers want to be able to do that in the context of Drupal. We've run into some problems with it. We got like kind of close, but not quite there, and had to put it aside. And for something that really is a completely separate dependency, we haven't found quite the perfect way to make that work so that if you change JavaScript, it automatically just refreshes inside of Drupal. Hopefully we can solve that one, but haven't done it yet. And then just some lessons learned, and again, this is an ongoing project. I'm sure we'll keep learning things. But we're using Webpack everywhere, but the Webpack builds are a little bit different. They're doing their job, but sometimes it's a little frustrating that the build process is a little bit different and has its own quirks in each place. Kind of makes sense because it's Drupal and React, but it doesn't make it any more fun. And then versioning continues to be important. Really got to be strict with that here. We had, even just kind of early on, when we started pulling this in as a dependency, we had situations where like variables changed and that had problems with our Webpack builds and some of the projects. So being strict and really controlling when you're pulling in the design system is still important. And then, I don't know, this is a bit of a minor detail kind of in the weeds, but the Gatsby project that we used was something from Brad Foss called Style Guide Guide. And I think there are now simpler ways to do that with Gatsby. There's a plugin called Docs that does something similar. But there are still some problems with that where the styling for the style guide can leak into the components in some ways, which is problematic. So hopefully there'll be some improvements there. But kind of coming around, so I looked at a couple of different examples where we've found what we think are compelling reasons to use a design system as an external dependency. You may be wondering if it's something that you should do on a project. And as you might expect, there really isn't a black and white answer to that question. The Lullabot folks earlier today were talking about rebuilding lullabot.com and their use of Layout Builder. But they might have kind of some different motivations for their project. I mean, they do and did. They have a bunch of Drupal experts, and they want to use their Drupal team's Drupal skills and be as Drupal-y as possible, right? And they want to be able to use as much core functionality and contribute back to the project. That might be a situation where there really isn't a lot of value in having a design system be a separate dependency, because they want to be as Drupal-y as possible, and they're not necessarily going to reuse these components elsewhere. Some other things that you might consider when making a decision like this is, again, is there going to be value in reusing these components? Which is a tricky one because, for our company's site rebuild, we didn't actually know until we happened to have this available to us that we could reuse it. And then I'd also wonder about prototyping. I do think that keeping this separate can continue to encourage prototyping. It also might make things easier if you want to publish your style guide separately. But also, you have to ask yourself about your team's workflow and the makeup of your team. So is this approach going to fit in with your workflow? It's not a question I can necessarily answer for you. Your team's makeup, would this approach maybe make it possible for more people to contribute? And then also something that came up talking to somebody after giving a previous version of this talk. Taking this approach potentially does give you more control over the elements of your design system. And these are kind of things that are a strict dependency, and you wouldn't be able to muck with them in your Drupal project, for example. So that may or may not be a desirable thing. If you have problems with keeping these components as designed, there could be some advantages there. But for us, especially with our site to rebuild, I think it had some advantages for us, and I'm hoping that again that it is going to allow more people from our company to get their hands dirty on our site, which is hopefully a great thing. So just a couple of other things. I think everybody's heard about the unconference at this point, but that's tomorrow from 9:30 to 4:30. I'll definitely be there. Have a handful of ideas for things to play around with, but would love to talk more to you folks and learn more about what everybody else is doing. So excited for that. And definitely encourage you to give feedback on the camp, on this talk. I'll also be kicking around and happy to talk about this or any other things or what Mario's doing these days. We did start a little late, but might have time for a couple questions if anybody has questions. Yes?
I got a question about the Drupalisms that leak into your components if you use embedded. Do you have to account for them? Things that come to mind are things you might find in a render array. Cache tags, attributes for quick edit, or textual links, anything that will use those and have additional functionality.
Yep, good question. So the question was the Drupal specific things that tend to leak into components. Do you need to account for those? How do you account for those? Yes, and yes. And there are definitely ways to do that. Like Pattern Lab has a plugin that allows you to use the attributes array. As far as caching, that can become a problem depending on how you're getting at the data that you pass into those templates. In a lot of cases, the caching stuff comes through, but sometimes with reference entities, it can be a problem. There's workarounds for that. Sometimes it's as simple as just actually in the Drupal template that's referencing the component to just render out that entity anyway so that you get the typical caching and cache tags handled. And just the other high-level thing that I've kind of landed on personally is to keep the variables and the components pretty high level. So take something like an image. Somebody who's just building a front-end component might want to say, I've got my image URL, and I've got my alt tag, and I've got, as individual fields. But instead, if you just say that this variable represents an image, you can let Drupal do what it does to make an image, which it's really good at, and spit that into the template. And I don't think you necessarily get a ton of value in splitting that out. So in cases where you can get out of the way and just let Drupal do its Drupal thing and pass in its data, you're better off with that. Does that help? Make sense? Maybe a little bit?
Yeah.
Cool. Any other questions? Cool. Thanks, everybody.